Hello and welcome. I'm Rachel Stone and I'm the HR and Safeguarding Team Leader for the Baptist Union of Great Britain. I'm here today in Bristol and we're filming just outside of Bristol Baptist College. Each year more than 9,000 people from Baptist churches across England and Wales attend one of our Excellence in Safeguarding training sessions. But this year we all find ourselves in a very different situation. Coronavirus restrictions mean that we can't run our face-to-face training safely at the moment. So we've produced this film to act as a reminder of all of the key message of our level 2 and 3 safeguarding training until we can start face-to-face training again. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought big changes to our society and to our churches, and each of us have had to adapt to a different pattern of daily life and different ways of being in contact with each other. Many of our church services and meetings have moved online and some have stopped altogether for the time being. This makes it harder for us to support those who may be vulnerable or at risk of harm. Our children and youth teams have done an amazing job at keeping in contact with families, but many young people especially are struggling with the restrictions and the social isolation that lockdown brings. As we talk today, we'll be thinking particularly about how our safeguarding approach needs to be adapted or extended to fit the new situations we find ourselves in. If you are watching this, you're likely to be a minister, leader, church worker or volunteer in a Baptist church somewhere in England or Wales. If you've been through our Excellence Safeguarding training before, then this update will refresh your memory and give you the chance to reflect on the experiences you've had in your church role since your last training session. If you haven't been through our training before and you're new to safeguarding, this film will be a great introduction and overview. You may still have questions about how safeguarding is managed in your church, so please do take time to follow up with your church's designated person for safeguarding or the leader of the group that you work with. Today we'll be looking at safeguarding in terms of both children and adults at risk, and we're going to do this by looking at 7 key areas together. Each section has 3 parts, so information to help your understanding, a discussion or a shared experience from safeguarders at church or regional or national level, and a stop and consider set of questions for you, your chance to think about what you've just watched and heard and how to apply it to the role you take on in your church life. There's some work for you to do as you go through the session, and at points we'll be asking you questions about what happens in your church or your group and how you would respond if a safeguarding concern arose. Please do have paper and pen to hand to write down any action points you think you may need to follow up on. This could be things to follow up in your group or with the wider church you're part of. We'll let you know when to pause the video so you can take a few minutes to think these things through. Finally, if you find that as you watch this film today, you're becoming distressed or agitated, it might be that this is reminding you of abuse that you suffered in times past, or disclosures that others made to you that you didn't know what to do with. If that's the case, please stop the video and take some time just to be calm and to feel safe. The designated person for safeguarding in your church and your minister and other trusted friends at church will be happy to talk with you and to help you get the support that you might need to deal with what's come up in your mind and your heart today. So let's start at the beginning. What is safeguarding? Let's start by reminding ourselves of the formal definition. Safeguarding involves a range of activities aimed at promoting the individual's fundamental right to be safe. These include making and maintaining safe environments for all, having processes to follow should something go wrong, and support for everyone involved. For us, good safeguarding practice means that people of all ages are safer to attend church. It means that church workers, staff and volunteers are trained in how to deal with any concerns and feel confident about what they should be looking out for. For you, your church's safeguarding policy and procedures should help you feel more prepared for dealing with concerns and more comfortable with the responsibilities that you have in the role you take on in church life. You know what to look out for, who to speak to if you have a concern, and what action to take if that happens. When looking at safeguarding, we particularly focus on the safety of children and young people and adults at risk. So let's look at both of those groups in more detail. The law defines a child as anyone who's not yet reached their 18th birthday. So some 16-year-olds will be living independently or be in further education. They might be a member of the armed forces or in hospital, prison or a young offenders institution, but that doesn't change their status or their entitlement to services and protection under the Children's Act 1989. All children are deemed in need of protection because of their age, and this can also include the protection of unborn children from abuse. Most people are familiar with the need to safeguard children, but sadly most of the press headlines we see about safeguarding relate to cases where children have been abused by those that they should have been able to trust. We'll talk about that more later on in our session. We also need to protect those who are over 18, who might be at risk for a whole range of reasons. We use this definition, which helps us to understand that any one of us can be an adult at risk. An adult at risk is any adult aged 18 years or over who, due to disability, mental function, age or illness, or traumatic circumstances, may not be able to take care or protect themselves against the risk of significant harm, abuse, bullying or harassment, mistreatment or exploitation. So how can we work out who might be an adult at risk?
So an adult at risk of harm is a person aged 18 or over whose exposure to harm through abuse, exploitation or neglect may be increased by their personal characteristics, which may include but are certainly not limited to their age, disability, special educational needs, illness, mental or physical frailty or impairment, victim of previous abuse or traumatic event, language barriers to include English as a second language, or addiction. It can be difficult to identify an adult at risk of harm as their personal characteristics may not be visible. We may all be adults at risk of harm at some time, and the characteristics may be ongoing or short-term. Life circumstances can increase exposure to risk of harm and include, but again not limited to, isolation or loneliness, bereavement, finances and work and living conditions. Adults at risk may be in a state of heightened anxiety as circumstances change or remain uncertain in the COVID-19 pandemic, especially as furlough schemes end, unemployment increases and financial income is reduced.
Nikki, many of our national mental health charities are talking loudly about the increase in the number of people talking about experiencing suicidal thoughts.
The Samaritans report that coronavirus is disproportionately affecting the most vulnerable people in society and will exacerbate factors we know are related to suicide. In a survey of over 70,000 adults in the UK, just over 1 in 10 reported experiencing suicidal thoughts or thoughts of hurting themselves during the first week of lockdown. 2% reported to have self-harmed or attempted suicide during the first week of lockdown. COVID-19 is having a profound effect on the economy. We know that in times of recession, suicide rates rise. Those who are hardest hit by the economic downturn are also those who are at greatest risk of suicide.
So this is the first point in the video, to stop and consider the activities that are going on in your church. Please pause the video now and take a few minutes to consider the questions that are posed here and to make a note of your thoughts. When you've done that and you're ready, just press play to move on to the next section. We're going to think specifically now about safeguarding in a church context. So you may have done safeguarding training for your work or for another organisation where you volunteer, And you might be wondering why we offer training specifically for safeguarding in Baptist churches. Is safeguarding different in a church environment? Well, yes is the simple answer. Our churches are open environments where everybody is welcome. Church life is far less formal than the work environment, and it tends to involve many more volunteers who are running and leading groups, helping and supporting, and providing pastoral care. Church is also a place where those who have survived abuse and the perpetrators of abuse could potentially all be under one roof. This is why it's so important that we understand what good safeguarding practice looks like for our church and all the ways in which we connect with and serve our local communities. There are many international, European and national policies and pieces of legislation that underpin the importance of safeguarding and working to best practice standards. More detail is available in your pack and on our website if you'd like to understand more about the law. At the heart of the safeguarding framework in most of our churches is a clear safeguarding policy statement. Often if you walk into a Baptist church, you'll see this pinned to the wall, and sometimes it's available on the website as well. That sets out your church's commitment to safeguarding and also talks about who takes on key safeguarding roles. Your church will have detailed safeguarding procedures. These talk about the basics of putting a policy in place, applying procedures to each of your church's key groups and activities, and they also talk about what to do if a problem arises. If you're part of a group, maybe you're a youth leader, maybe you help with the lunch club, maybe you're part of the pastoral care team, then there will be specific guidelines for you about what good safeguarding looks like for the activity that you participate in. So that will include risk assessments, action plans, and pastoral support arrangements. I've asked Gary Woodall, who's a regional minister and the safeguarding lead for the West of England Baptist Network, to talk to us about how WebNet churches have been putting all of this into action.
I think the first thing is to make sure that the right policy and procedures there, and it is imperative that churches on a regular basis update their policies. And at the same time, that as a whole congregation understand that this is a safe place. There's some really useful resources on the Baptist Together website. There's a very good short video that could be used in church services and church meetings. But it's important that at annual general meetings, churches go through and reaffirm their policy and reaffirm the designated person in safeguarding. That's really important to do. The second part, I think, where most of our churches, all of our churches actually have got to, is actually designating those people who are going to be that designated person for safeguarding. Those churches, especially leadership teams, need to trust those people. Because when it comes to an allegation of abuse or dealing with abuse, those people are the people the church are putting their responsibility in to care for them. So I think for the first thing is the right policies. The second thing is to have the right people in place. The third part then is actually to trust people. So often in our churches, we want everybody to know. We all want to know the information. In these situations, one of the strengths of a good safeguarding procedure in a local church is where people trust those who have responsibility. The fourth part then is actually you can come to us as an association at any time to provide support, to get information, and just to seek that reassurance that what you're doing is correct.
Pastoral support is absolutely key to our church life, and many of us will have benefited from the support and kindness and walking with that others have provided to us. Pastoral support arrangements in safeguarding situations are equally important, and most churches will have thought about how to support all of the people involved when a safeguarding issue emerges. Finally, we encourage all churches to do a review of their safeguarding policy at their church meeting, normally the annual general meeting. It's a great opportunity to remind people of it, but also a chance to update or add if the church has started working in different ways, as we all have at the moment, or where new activities have become part of what you do. Some of our church activities are designed specifically for children and young people. Other groups are designed around the needs of adults, and some need to reflect both adults and children. That's why we recommend that your safeguarding policy covers both children, young people and adults at risk in one policy. Within your church, everyone has a responsibility for safeguarding. But as we've already touched on, some people have specific responsibility. You can see these roles appearing on the screen. Each church should have at least one designated person for safeguarding, the DPS, who's appointed by the church meeting. This person is the first point of contact if anyone discloses or suspects abuse, and they are the link between the church, your local association safeguarding person, and any external organisations who you need to involve. You may have one DPS in your church, and some bigger churches have two working in the role. You don't need to have separate DPSs for children and for adults at risk, but some churches choose to work in that way. Working behind the scenes in your church will be a DBS verifier. This is the person who takes responsibility for processing criminal records checks for church staff and volunteers, with the exception of your minister. So the DBS verifier checks applicants' identity documents, assists people to complete the application, and then receives and records the outcome. So the outcome will tell you whether or not the applicant is cleared to work in the role that they've shown an interest in. It's a behind-the-scenes role, but it's really important, as DBS checking is part of the way in which we make sure that we are recruiting safely. Now, the trustees and elders and deacons of your church are ultimately responsible for ensuring that your safeguarding policy is implemented in the church. If there were to be an incident that resulted in an investigation of the church's policies and practices, it would be the trustees, elders and deacons who are deemed to be responsible. So it's vital that all trustees understand and support your church's safeguarding policy and procedures. Last but definitely not least, your church's minister shares with the trustees the general responsibility for adopting and implementing the church's safeguarding policy. Your minister will be made aware of any safeguarding issues within the church by your DPS, but doesn't need to hold the detail. But the minister does take responsibility for making sure that the pastoral needs of all are being met. There's lots more information about these roles and responsibilities in the resource pack that comes with this film. As you might imagine, there are lots of areas of church life where it's important to think about safeguarding best practice. A best practice is about doing all we can to make the church as safe as possible for everyone involved. So we're going to stop and consider again. I'd like you to take a minute to think through some of the areas showing on the screen right now. Pause the video if you need to and think about how this works for your church. So, for example, what does your church safeguarding policy say about handling money on behalf of older people? What's allowed in terms of taking photos of adults and children in the church? Is there more work to do to develop your church practices in some of these areas? In this film, we don't have time to go through all of these best practice areas in great detail, but you can find out more from your church's safeguarding procedures or from the range of safeguarding guides available free of charge on the Baptist Union's website. On your invitation to this session, you'll also find a link to our resources page, and that will link you directly to some of our key safeguarding guides and resources. So here's your next opportunity to stop and think. Starting with what you know about safeguarding in your church, pause the video now and take a few minutes to consider the questions posed here. Take a minute to jot down your thoughts, and when you're ready, press start to resume the video. We're going to move on now and spend some time talking about abuse. We're going to look together at different types of abuse. And before we start, I want to say that more detailed information on all that I'm talking about in this section including the indicators and symptoms of abuse, are given in the resource pack that accompanies this film. I would encourage you to find a quiet moment to read through that pack, even if you've read it before, to remind yourself of some of the signs that a person may be being abused. There are many different ways in which people suffer abuse, but there are 4 main types of abuse that are often used to describe harm. Physical abuse, in relation to children, is actual or likely physical injury or failure to prevent physical injury to a child. In terms of an adult at risk, physical abuse is inflicting pain, physical injury or suffering to an adult at risk. Emotional abuse towards a child would be persistent emotional ill treatment that affects the child's emotional and behavioural development. It may involve conveying to the child that they are worthless and unloved, inadequate, or that they are given responsibilities way beyond their years. For an adult at risk, emotional abuse might include the use of threats, fear, or power gained by another adult's position to invalidate the person's independent wishes. Such behaviour can create very real emotional and psychological distress, and all forms of abuse have some emotional component to them. Child sexual abuse involves forcing or enticing a child to take part in sexual activities, whether or not the child is aware of what's happening. This includes non-contact activities, such as involving children in looking at or in producing pornographic material or watching sexual activities, or encouraging children to behave in sexually inappropriate ways. In terms of adults at risk, sexual abuse is any non-consenting sexual act or behaviour. No one should enter into a sexual relationship with someone for whom they have pastoral responsibility or hold a position of trust. And finally, neglect for children is where adults fail to care for children and protect them from danger, often seriously impairing their health and their development. For an adult at risk, a person's well-being can be impaired and their care needs are not met when neglect takes place. Neglect can be deliberate, or it can occur as a result of someone not understanding what someone's needs are. We see all of these types of abuse occurring in church families and in the communities in which we work. As well as those 4 main areas, there are a whole range of other types of ways in which people are abused. That includes financial abuse, spiritual abuse, which we'll come on to in a second, discrimination in all of its forms, domestic abuse, self-harm, institutional abuse, where abuse is widely known about and happens within a whole organisation, forced marriage, and female genital mutilation. Let's stop for a second and look at a type of abuse that particularly relates to faith-based settings. We now have a growing understanding that there are types of abuse that can arise in relation to expressions of faith. We call this spiritual abuse. Dr. Lisa Oakley defines spiritual abuse as a form of emotional and psychological abuse. It's characterised by a systematic pattern of coercive and controlling behaviour in a religious context. And this has parallels with the way that domestic abuse is perpetrated within the home. Spiritual abuse can have a deeply damaging impact on those who experience it. And we do need to understand that this can sometimes be a real concern in our churches. Ministers and church leaders especially need to be aware of the potential for spiritual abuse, particularly where the church culture becomes unhealthy for a time. Well, we've talked about types of abuse. We're going to go on and talk about a precursor to abuse. So we're going to talk for a little while about grooming. How do abusers establish the connections that allow them to carry out abuse? Often they start by grooming an individual or their family, or sometimes a wider group, maybe a whole church, so that they can gain access to potential victims. The NSPCC defines grooming as when someone takes time to build an emotional connection with a child, young person, adult and/or family members in order to gain their trust for the purposes of abuse or exploitation. So in summary, this is building a relationship and then using that relationship to abuse someone. So why do abusers attempt to groom their victims first? Well, by building emotional connections with potential victims, they may reduce the risk of discovery or the risk that the victim talks to someone else about what's going on. Often, grooming involves isolating someone from their friends and family. It may make the abusive behaviour seem normal or accepted to the victim, or it may make them feel too scared to resist. Grooming may help the abuser to get introductions to or to identify further victims. Now, grooming doesn't just take place face-to-face. It can take place remotely using things like internet chat rooms, social networking sites like Facebook, or even through texting, or through direct contacts such as babysitting, befriending families, and through church activities. It sounds really frightening, doesn't it? The idea that someone might deliberately set out to cause harm by pretending to be caring and trustworthy. We know that people who are good at grooming are often charming and well-liked individuals, or they wouldn't be very good at grooming. It can be really hard to tell the difference between genuine social warmth and the skills used by someone who is grooming. Remember, sometimes grooming takes place across a whole group of people, even a whole church. So always follow your church safeguarding procedures, no matter how well liked and respected the alleged perpetrator is, or how long you have known them for. It is a really tricky situation. When we go to church with people regularly over many years, we like to think that we know them well, and often we do. We trust our own judgment as to their character and what sort of person they are. Often there's much to be said for this. We serve together. We build friendships and support each other through the ups and downs of life. This is a good thing. But sometimes we can be too confident about our own ability to spot problems. Both in a church and in our wider communities, sometimes we are misled by people who have set out to harm others.
Nikki, why don't people disclose of abuse when it happens?
Well, actually, many people who've experienced abuse don't tell anyone what's happened until years later, with around a third of people abused in childhood waiting until adulthood or even old age before they share their experience. For some, the delay in disclosing the abuse is because they were manipulated into keeping quiet with threats or intimidation from the person who abused them. Ministers who abuse will often use spiritual threats, such as "you'll go to hell if you tell anyone," or "you'll hurt God if you tell." There's such a great fear of the consequence of telling, what the abuser will do to them, their family or someone they care about, that they continue to believe in the power of the abuser long after the abuse has stopped and even after the abuser has died. Children who are abused from a young age may not even know that what they're experiencing is abusive behaviour. If the abuse is carried out by someone known, trusted or loved, there may also be a desire to not get the person that they care about into trouble, and so they keep quiet.
So what's the impact on the local church when a disclosure has happened?
The idea of abuse within the church context, particularly perpetrated by someone in ministry or leadership role, is so threatening to the confidence held both in the church and in God that a common reaction is to refuse to believe the person has experienced abuse. It can feel far easier to reject the accusation as lies, or attention-seeking, being mistaken or even malicious, rather than to have the pain and discomfort of questioning and challenging our beliefs in God, the church, and those who minister to us.
Thank you.
Now, in society and in church life, there are some common misconceptions about abuse, and sometimes we hear these from church staff and volunteers coming along to our safeguarding training. Perhaps you might share some of these views. It is very easy to think that abuse happens somewhere else, not in our church, not in our community, but research tells us this is just not true. The recent government inquiry into child sexual abuse has been running an investigation specifically into child abuse in faith-based settings. And this has included all of the major Christian denominations, including us as Baptists. Often we find it hard to accept that people in church, maybe even in leadership roles, may carry out abuse. We tend to be very trusting of others, and sometimes we can be too keen to believe the word of those who may actually have caused real harm. The biggest myth about abuse is that the danger comes from strangers. In most cases, the perpetrator is someone the parent or child knows and is often already trusted by both the child and their family. I'd like to share with you some statistics from the NSPCC. These may surprise you, they may certainly shock you, but it's important that we understand the nature of abuse. So research done in 2011 shows that over 90% of children who were abused by someone they already knew. 1 in 14 children have experienced emotional abuse by a parent or a guardian, the person who is supposed to keep them safe. And around 1/3 of sexual abuse against children is committed by other children and young people. And abuse can happen anywhere, at home, at school, at work, in hospitals, in care homes, in vehicles, and in churches. You'll know from the headlines that we also see an increasing amount of abuse taking place online. So I've asked Nikki to share with us some information about the range of types of people who abuse, and to share with us some of the statistical data available recently about safeguarding issues during lockdown. So Nikki, I'm back with more questions. Nikki, do we need to look at our church safeguarding procedures to make sure that we are prepared for the additional or adapted risks that are happening in lockdown?
Yes, the Social Care Institute for Excellence reported in June 2020 that during the pandemic, those who are particularly vulnerable might accept help from those who seek to exploit them. While there's been an amazing response to the call for helpful volunteers, we cannot rule out the possibility of a few people who may see this as an opportunity to gain easy access to those who are vulnerable in order to exploit them. For instance, when volunteering in food banks, in-depth support, going for shopping and prescription collections. The greatest opportunity for abuse during the COVID-19 crisis is financial. With additional pressures on services, normal service functions, fear and isolation, the window is open to those who may seek to exploit those who may be vulnerable. Again, the Social Care Institute for Excellence published early data showing a 400% increase in fraud reporting in March 2020 relating to the COVID-19 crisis. The Chartered Trading Standards Institute has warned the public not to open their doors to bogus healthcare workers claiming to be offering home testing for COVID-19. But in practice, will fear of bogus visitors prevent those adults at risk from opening their doors to support?
So we can see that there are some real safeguarding risks arising out of lockdown, Nikki. Are there any other areas where reports of abuse are rising during this time?
Yes, definitely. The Social Care Institute for Excellence reports other types of abuse have escalated since lockdown began, including domestic abuse. Some living with an abusive partner or family members have seen an escalation in abuse due to the added tensions and frustration caused by the whole family having to spend more time in the house. The tensions can be further increased where families are living in cramped and temporary accommodation. Victims of domestic abuse are telling the charity Safe Lives that they're frightened about how the COVID-19 restrictions are increasing the risk to themselves and their children, as well as fears about being locked in with a perpetrator They're also worried about the impact of lockdown on their mental health. Women's Aid have published a report called A Perfect Storm, the impact of COVID-19 on domestic abuse survivors and the services supporting them. Women's Aid report that domestic abuse has got worse during the pandemic. 2/3 of survivors identifying as currently experiencing abuse said their abuser has started using lockdown restrictions or the COVID-19 virus and its consequences as part of the abuse. Over half of survivors identifying as currently experiencing abuse experienced deteriorating mental health, which left them feeling less able to cope with the abuse. Over half of survivors who had experienced abuse in the past said that the pandemic had triggered memories of abuse and affected their mental health. Women reported that the abuse they experienced got worse during the pandemic. This finding was especially true for those women living with their abuser.
So what is happening in the mind of a potential abuser? David Finkelhor is an American sociologist who has developed a model often called the 4 preconditions of abuse to show the stages which someone must go through or the hurdles they go over in order to perpetrate abuse. Now, Finkelhor's model was developed mostly in relation to the sexual abuse of children. However, the model is equally applicable to perpetrators who abuse adults and those who abuse people of any age in a non-sexual way. The order is always sequential, but the timescale for each step may vary from just a few minutes to many years. So, the 4 stages or hurdles are, first of all, having the motivation to offend. Secondly, internal inhibitors, so dealing with your own conscience. Thirdly, external inhibitors, so creating an opportunity to offend. And fourthly, victim resistance, feeling that you can abuse and get away with it. With each progressive stage, the hurdle gets lower and lower, as you can see in this illustration. Now, let's look at each of those stages in more detail. We'll start with motivation, wanting to offend. This is where the person has a desire to fulfill an emotional or physical need through some sort of illegal activity or abuse. This could include fantasies, reenactment, or inappropriate patterns of arousal. They then move on to overcoming internal inhibitors. This is basically dealing with their conscience. So this person knows that the behaviour is wrong and that it goes against their conscience. So they have to put in place a way of thinking which gives them permission to carry out the desired act. Once people have convinced themselves that this doesn't breach their own conscience, they go on to look at external inhibitors. That's creating the opportunity to offend. So at this stage, there's a focus on getting into a position which gives access to a potential victim. This could be someone specific, or it could be a range of victims. So this stage, this could include grooming the family of a potential victim, so spending lots of time with them, getting to know them, all the while building their trust. It could be working or volunteering as a youth or children's leader, getting involved in organisations which work with vulnerable people to allow them access. It could be offers to babysit. Or it could be living, working or putting themselves in areas where they know there will be potential victims. For example, they could walk home from work on a route that goes via the children's playground. The final hurdle is overcoming victim resistance, doing it and getting away with it, basically. This can be achieved in a number of ways, sometimes by coercion and force, by violence or the threat of violence used to overcome the victim's resistance to abuse. However, often it's more subtle behaviour, particularly if the victim and their family have already been groomed by the abuser. For example, it might be that the victim has been led to believe over a period of time that no one will believe them if they say what's happening. They might have been offered some rewards for their cooperation, the latest tech, new clothes. They might have been given the message repeatedly that if they disclose what's going on, something terrible will happen to them, or their friends, or their family, or even their pet. They may be told that if they disclose, then they will destroy their own family and that they would be responsible for the family breakup and their siblings going into care. They're often told that they'll be responsible for destroying the abuser's life, particularly if the abuser is a family member or someone in a position of authority. Often victims will be told that their reputation will be ruined and tarnished if they disclose, and that they will lose the special relationship that the abuser has bestowed upon them. They will often be looking for opportunities to repeat that abuse, either with the same person or with others. We need to remind ourselves that most abusers are already in the social or family setting where their victim lives, goes to school or works. So it can be so difficult for a victim to gather up courage to disclose what's been happening to them. If you are new to safeguarding responsibilities, I just want to reassure you that it's most likely that the offences you will come across as a church worker or volunteer will have happened outside of the church setting rather than within. But abuse does happen within the church, and there are offenders who will target churches specifically. So we need to be aware of the potential risks. That's why we work so hard together to have up-to-date safeguarding policies and procedures in place, and to make sure that all of our leaders, workers, teams and ministers are trained to the right level. We're hoping and aiming to be excellent in safeguarding across Baptist Together. So now please pause your film again and take a few minutes to stop and consider the questions on the slide. Once you've had the chance to do that, please resume the video. We're about halfway through our session now, so I think it's a good time to take a break. Maybe you want to go and grab a cup of coffee. Maybe it's time for a stretch or a walk. When we come back, we'll be moving on to our next section. Press pause for the meantime, and I'll see you in a few minutes. For me, this next section is one of the most important areas we're going to be covering today. What should you do if you have safeguarding concerns? We're going to work through a 4-step model together of what to do and who to tell. It's the 4 R's: recognise, respond, record and report. It's not always easy to recognise when harm or abuse are taking place. So it's really important to act if you suspect abuse. Please don't wait until you're absolutely sure or you have solid proof. The piece of information you bring may help complete a picture that shows that abuse is happening. If you have concerns, if you're not sure what you're seeing, you can always refer to the indicators and types of abuse handout in your resource pack, and that will show you the sort of things that may mean something is wrong. But if your gut is telling you that there's a problem, if you've seen something that makes you feel anxious and concerned, it's important that you recognise that now is the time to tell somebody. Step 2 is responding. If someone discloses to you that either they are experiencing abuse or that they've witnessed abuse, there are some important guidelines for you. First of all, don't promise confidentiality. We'll come on to this a bit later with regards to adults, but whether it's an adult or a child who's disclosing, you need to make it clear that you will have to pass on what they've told you to your designated person for safeguarding, the DPS. Listen and take what is said seriously. Do what you can to reassure them and tell them they've done the right thing in telling you and that you are taking it seriously. and do try to remain calm. That can be difficult, but if you panic, then they are likely to panic and to stop disclosing. Whatever you hear, try not to show shock or disgust or embarrassment, even if you are very affected by what you hear. Your reaction might stop the person disclosing, or might make them feel that you're making a judgment on them rather than whatever has happened to them. When someone starts to disclose something to you, you may need to ask them some simple questions to understand what has happened. It is really important that you don't start to investigate or interview the person who's talking to you. So if you do need to ask some really simple questions to check what's happened, just use a few and give the person room to tell their own story. For example, tell me about where you were when this happened. Could you explain to me how you got there? Could you describe to me what happened? We recommend that you never use leading questions, and where possible, just let the person speak without prompting. If you do need to prompt them with questions, keep a note of those and the answers they give, and stop asking questions as soon as it's clear that a situation is or may be abusive. It's not your job to investigate, and if you push too far, you could both distress the individual and potentially compromise work that maybe the police or the social services teams need to do later. Step 3 then is to record what you've heard. So to write down the concerns you have or what you heard from someone else without delay. We would say within 24 hours. Now, there is an example safeguarding incident form in the pack with today's session, but at the end of the day, the important thing is that you've kept a good note of what you heard, and you can use the 4 W's to make sure you've got all the right information. So our 4 W's start with who was involved, what were the names of the key people involved. The second W is what actually happened. Record the facts of what you hear, not your opinions about it, however tempted you might be to give your own view. Thirdly is where did this happen? And fourthly, when did this happen? This might be one event, so it might be a single date and time, or someone might be telling you about things that have been happening to them over an extended period of time. Once you have this basic information, you need to talk to your church DPS. That could be a face-to-face conversation, or at the moment it's far more likely to be by telephone or by Zoom or Teams in the first instance. But it should always be followed up by passing on your written note. You don't need to type up your note. It's just important that the information is clear and that it reflects everything you've heard. Again, I just want to stress to you, it's not your job to investigate. Once you've referred the concerns or the disclosure to your church DPS, you should step back at that point and let them continue the process. They will decide what happens next, including whether the statutory authorities, the police or social services need to be involved, or in the case of a church worker acting in an inappropriate way, whether to speak to them to reinforce good practice guidelines or to think about whether they need to be removed from their role. I've said this already, but it is worth remembering that an albeit well-intentioned investigation by people in the church could undermine and jeopardise a future statutory investigation. We don't want to muddy the waters. We want to make sure that we're doing our part in the process well. Please keep confidentiality. Once you've referred on the concerns or the disclosure to your church DPS, you should not be telling anybody else. That's really important. So that includes not sharing information with others, including your spouse or family members, and not sharing it even for prayer purposes. Safeguarding concerns need to be held in confidence, recognising that they deal with difficult, distressing and highly personal aspects of people's lives. Kay, it's lovely to speak to you this morning. Kay Cook is the church designated person for safeguarding for Clarence Park Baptist Church in Weston-super-Mare, and she's also one of our national safeguarding trainers. Kay, you've been a church DPS for a long time, and I wanted to ask you, in your experience, what makes people reluctant to report concerns about possible abuse in church?
Okay, good morning, Rachel. I think one of the things is we have a need to see the best in people, and often people don't want to believe what they've seen or heard. People sometimes worry about the fact that they've got it wrong, and that links into what might people think of them if they tell or if they whistleblow. Sometimes it's that they don't want to get someone into trouble or appear to be judgmental, especially if the allegation relates to someone in the church who they worship alongside or somebody that they know and respect. I think occasionally it's because they're not sure who to talk to, but I think that's getting much better now as more churches become excellent in safeguarding. I think another point might be that we see so much on the TV and the media that people worry about the potential consequences of reporting something. Again, I think that those that attend the Baptist Union Excellence in Safeguarding, that helps to dispel some of those myths. We need to keep children, young people and adults at risk at the centre of everything that we do, especially with regards to safeguarding.
Thank you, Kay. So as a DPS, how do you make the decision about what to report to the statutory authorities?
Okay, I think that's a really difficult one, because often it's people that have got a professional background in safeguarding who take on the role of the designated person for safeguarding. And I think primarily we have to remember that it's not our job to investigate. Personally, I was a police officer for 21 years, and 16 of those was investigating abuse. But when I'm in my church, I am there as the designated person for safeguarding, and so I have to follow my church procedures. As I say, something I think that we often struggle with. It's not our job to investigate. As designated person for safeguarding, we listen, we observe, we check out what is already known, and then we pass that on if that's necessary. Also, there's some differences in reporting requirements for children and for adults at risk. We must share information about children, but adults have the right, even if we don't agree with them, to tell us not to. And I think that can become a challenge as well.
Well, that's an interesting point, isn't it? And one we get lots of questions about, Kay. Could you tell us more about reporting concerns about adults at risk specifically?
Yeah, sure. Legally, adults have a right to tell you not to pass on safeguarding information that relates to them personally. And that's something personally I find really difficult, but it is their right. However, the Baptist Union guidance is that even when an adult says they don't want that piece of information about them to be passed on to statutory agency, we should always report that information to the designated person for safeguarding. What that allows the DPS to do is to sort of put the pieces of the jigsaw together. It means also that if a person changes their mind, then there's always a record of that information. But when that information is passed to the DPS, it should clearly say on it that the person doesn't want the information to be passed on. Now, there are 3 situations where the DPS can, if necessary, pass on information to statutory authorities. So would it be helpful if I went through those now?
Yes, please.
Okay, so the first one is clearly when an adult agrees to you passing that information on that they've shared about themselves. Secondly, if you think that that individual doesn't have the mental capacity. Now, personally, I'm not an expert in mental capacity, so I won't dwell on that one, but that is one of the overriding factors. The final one, which I think is what relates to us most in the Baptist Union, is of public interest concern. So that is about the risk of harm to others or to prevent further crimes. Now, if the DPS has all the pieces of that jigsaw I talked about, then they'll be able to discern links between crimes. So that might be an alleged offender who is targeting more than one person in the church. And the church is an environment where there will usually be a potential risk to others. But if it's in a situation like a domestic abuse disclosure, we know from research that before someone discloses, there will have already been many instances. So this one is unlikely to be the last. So this one for me is about that preventing further crimes, and those can be to the same person that's telling you or to others. If everything is passed on to the designated person for safeguarding, then they can build those pieces of the jigsaw together and they can pass on to those who can investigate if that becomes necessary.
Thank you, Kay. We get asked so many questions about that, and it's good to clarify. Kay, so many church meetings and services have now moved online over the last few months. In your church, how have you adapted or extended your safeguarding procedures to fit with these new situations?
Okay, well, we're actually only opening still for one evening service midweek at the moment. Everything else is taking place online, but we are following the same fundamental principles of good safeguarding practice. There's a lot of information on the Baptist Union website, baptist.org.uk, specific to the pandemic, but also about how we should be operating with regards to safeguarding. And the whole principle of excellence in safeguarding is that the same principles apply in every situation, regardless of the age of the person who is the who we're concerned about. Firstly, that it's not your job to investigate, that you should listen, observe and pass that information to your DPS, noting that if an adult has said they don't want the information to be passed on, but it's not their job to investigate either. They will listen, observe, check what they already know and pass that information on to the statutory agencies if necessary. It is their job to investigate. Now, I think if new activities or contexts are being used, now we're using online so much more, then they all need to be risk assessed, just like we did before the pandemic. And again, there's guidance on the Baptist Union website for that. But for example, if you're running children or youth work online, then you need to do all the same things. You always have to have at least 2 adults in the meeting before the children arrive. You need to make sure that you've got permissions from parents. And then if you have any concerns, then you pass them on to the designated person for safeguarding. I think if we are excellent in safeguarding, it will always be about keeping children, young people and adults at risk at the centre of our safeguarding practice. But with the pandemic, we have a unique opportunity with things like online meetings to glimpse inside someone's home environment. So as I say, if we see things that we don't normally have access to, we just follow the same principles, listen, observe and pass it on. But most importantly, it is about those basic excellent in safeguarding messages. Risk assessing, it's not your job to investigate, listen, observe, pass it on.
Thank you, Kay. That's really helpful. Thanks so much for your input today. Rachel, it's good to be talking with you. So I'm talking with Rachel Swaby, who's the Regional Safeguarding Lead for the London Baptist Association. But Rachel is also the DPS for her church, which is New Park Road Baptist Church in Streatham Hill in southwest London. So Rachel, you have different perspectives on the safeguarding issues we're going to talk about today. So Rachel, how can we help churches that are new to safeguarding to understand the need to report?
Thanks, Rachel. That's a really good question. I think, firstly, we need to help churches actually identify what a safeguarding issue is. Many times people have been working in their church environments for many years. They've built up good relationships and good friendships with each other, and they actually have very close bonds. So it's really difficult to be able to separate the person from the actual incidents. So I think as a real starter is identifying the different types of safeguarding issues that actually arise. So this could be, for example, physical abuse, emotional abuse, spiritual abuse. Many churchgoers and congregations don't even know that these different areas of safeguarding exist. So it's really important to educate churches to understand these areas exist and what they need to do to look out and identify potential risks. Also, I believe in churches we're such a great mix of people, which is grand. You know, we really, really celebrate that. So there's people coming from different cultures, different backgrounds, different classes. There's a range of differences, and it's important that some things that may have been acceptable or really deemed as normal in some cultures, really here we would, you know, they would possibly fall into one of those different areas of safeguarding needs. And if people don't understand, they don't know, they've never heard that this is not the norm, how will they be able to recognise it? So it's also taking into consideration people's background, their cultural perspectives, and understanding how they may see things differently as well.
Thank you, Rachel. So in your experience, are church leaders and the DPSs in churches nervous of contacting statutory authorities when allegations or problems arise?
In my experience, this is something I come across very regularly, actually. What I often find, going back to actually the point I made earlier, is that again in churches people have built up friendships, relationships, and when a incident arises, it's difficult to say, right, well, this is my friend, I really, really know this person. How could they possibly have done that? You know, it must have been something's gone wrong. So they really find it difficult to set apart the incident from the actual person and look at it, you know, objectively. I think, again, that's one of the reasons why it's really important to have a really strong safeguarding policy in place, because if you have a strong safeguarding policy, this identifies different roles for different individuals that make up part of the safeguarding team. Ideally, if we have a good, solid policy, safeguarding policy in place, then the minister or pastor is able to support the individual pastorally, and the DPS or members of the safeguarding team are able to take on a more investigative role. If that all works well, then we are sure we have covered all bases. The perpetrator or alleged perpetrator is looked after and cared for, and also we are ensuring that we minimise risk and take care of the people that are possibly alleged victims.
That's such a thing, isn't it? Pastoral support separately for all those who are involved in an incident. So how do churches respond when church members or attendees are accused of safeguarding offences, Rachel?
Well, I would say mainly the main response I've seen in my experience so far is almost a reaction of disbelief.
Right.
You know, there's often an action of disbelief that, you know, this person, you know, it says they've committed this offence, but it doesn't really sink in. This is often what I find. And the pastors and ministers, you know, they're in their role for a reason. They've been called for the reason to care for people. So it's really understandable that that's part of who they are. But often if the minister alone has not got a strong safeguarding team around them, then often the response may be a little too informal. They're not very willing and able to kind of make those really clear decisions and take things forward step by step. So that's often something that we come across in the role. Also, there's the need to really focus on risk and managing risk, because part of what safeguarding is once a risk has been identified, we need to manage that risk to ensure it reduces the potential harm to other victims. That's what we're really there for. That's an area that we find a lot of ministers need support with, and you know what, it's quite normal to need support, and it's really important that they realise they're not alone. Often these issues we come across are new to us all. We never, you know, every situation is completely different. It's very rare that two situations are identical. So it's really important to realise that there is a team of people here to support and talk through these ideas so we can work out a solution together as a team.
Thank you. I think it's so important that DPSs at church level understand that there is regional support available in every one of our 13 regional associations, and that there's someone there who's probably more experienced and who can provide them with some good backup and advice. Thank you. Well, we've been through very challenging times over the last several months. your church, Rachel, looked at the safeguarding issues arising around using social media as a key way to communicate with people, but particularly with children and young people during lockdown?
Well, this was a real challenge for us because the lockdown came on quite suddenly, so we had to make some really key decisions quite quickly. I think the first point of contact, or the first thing that we did, was have conversations with other churches and denominations in our own scenario. So working together with other youth ministers, other people in the same role as you, to find out what's happening elsewhere. So you're not working alone, you're working with a team of people. I think team is really, really important. Then looking at that and looking at how going forward we can look online for guidance. Online there's lots of different guidance, and also during these changing times, guidance updates very regularly. So it's really important to look at what the latest guidance is. There's lots of websites. The Baptist Union can point you to lots, but there's lots of other websites like CEOP and Think You Know that help parents and just young people working with young people to understand what the latest social media guidance is. That's really, really important. Secondly, I think it's really important to speak to your team. So your team who you're working with, make sure as a church that you don't hold that information for yourself. You make sure you pass it on to others, so you're all working, singing to the same hymn sheet. You're all working together and you're all kept well informed as to where the church stands and what the latest policies are. Finally, when we're working with youth and children, it's really, really important that we have parents on board and parents completely understand what the parameters are and what the rules and regulations, where we stand as a church, and how we expect or need their support in order for us to be able to continue with our activities online. So, for example, at our church, when we have our online services, we make sure that there's always 2 adults present with working with the youth, and also that there's a parent present in the room, so that we're not left alone with children. If we have any contact online, maybe via WhatsApp, parents are always included in the groups, so that children are not connecting with adults, especially younger children under 13, without their permission. So one of the ways that we've worked to ensure that we've been able to still deliver some services, but still thinking about safety and keeping everybody safe.
Thank you, Rachel. It's a joint effort all round, isn't it? And those tips, I hope, are going to be of real help to other churches and church leaders as they're working with their children and young people. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you are the designated person for safeguarding for your church, don't forget to make sure that you have the contact details for all of these organisations stored somewhere that you can easily find them. You might want to add them to your phone's contact list and into your email addresses as well. For more information on each of these agencies, please see the resource pack. You can add your own details in there as well for local organisations who might be able to help. If there is an issue that raises concern, you may need to discuss this with a professional. These people are here to help you, so please don't be afraid of speaking to the police or to social services. You can always ring and speak about a hypothetical situation if you are unsure. However, while a hypothetical referral is better than no referral, you may not get accurate advice without giving names. So clearly the context of the person or their family situation will enable you to get the best advice. If you need to contact someone out of hours, these agencies normally have an emergency on-call contact number that you can use. But in an emergency, and if someone is in immediate danger, please just call 999. You should be aware that the police and social services teams talk to each other. So once you've reported something to the police or to social services, if they think the other agency needs to be involved, they will make that connection. In the past, the Christian Church has used the language of forgiveness and second chance somewhat lightly, and has effectively colluded with those who have used their positions of trust in the Church to gain the opportunity to harm and abuse. But if we don't forgive, are we denying the Christian gospel? Are we calling into question the power of Jesus to transform a person's heart? No, we are not. But we need to understand that we may not be the best person to determine how likely a person is to re-offend in the future. Forgiveness always entails risk. Restoring a relationship with someone who has broken trust in the past comes with the risk that they will break that trust again in the future, with all of the pain that that brings. Taking the risk of allowing those who offended against children or adults at risk in the past to work with them again in the future is a risk that we do not have the right to take. We don't have the right to take such risks when the cost of its failure will be borne by those who are vulnerable, who may already have been hurt, and for whom the potential cost is incalculable. The Bible commands us to protect those who are weak, vulnerable, or unable to protect themselves, and in church life this must always be our first priority. At the very core of the personality of a person who abuses is the ability to deceive both adults and children. There is no doubt that our God can transform a person's heart by the power of the Holy Spirit. However, we need to be careful that we don't make assumptions about our own ability to discern when such transformation is genuine and when it is not. There will be others who bear the cost of our mistake if we get this wrong. Those who have abused in the past should be helped to find a place in the life of the Christian community which supports them on their journey towards wholeness. A place which enables them to recognise, accept, and to live with the consequences of their past in the light of God's forgiveness and acceptance, but without putting other people at risk. Those who have abused should not be allowed into situations which give them the opportunity to abuse again, even when they show repentance. The Christian values of forgiveness and grace should not be used as a reason to justify allowing a person to enter, continue in, or resume a role in church life which they have compromised by their behaviour in the past, even though our instincts long for this to be the case. We simply create an opportunity for abuse to occur again. It doesn't matter how far in the past the previous incident occurred. The person needs to find a different place and role in the life of the church, which enables them and all those around them to thrive. These notes come from the website of an organisation called MOSAC, which stands for the Mothers of Sexually Abused Children. They recognise that there sometimes does come a point where victims and their families can reach the point of forgiving those who have hurt them. Bearing in mind the experiences of the members of this organisation, these statements are a calm and clear reflection of their view that forgiveness is possible. But the forgiveness does not lessen or in any way minimise the damage done to their children. When we work with the survivors of abuse and their families, we also need to be extremely careful about how we use the language of forgiveness. We can do real harm to survivors and their families even more when we push them to forgive before they are ready, before they've even had time to process some of the pain and anger that they feel towards the person or people who have committed the abuse. It is possible to reach a place where forgiveness can be found, but it's a long and difficult journey to get there for everyone involved. Jesus is very clear about the value of children and those who are vulnerable. He uses these very strong words in Matthew 18 and Matthew 25, both as an encouragement to love and care for those who are weaker, vulnerable and in need, and also to warn us in no uncertain terms of the consequences of leading others into sin or ignoring cries for help. Many people watching this film today are watching because we're leaders in our churches, and it's important that we model the standards of behaviour, integrity and accountability that we would expect from others in our church. This is more than just being aware of your church's policies and procedures. It's about being a role model for good safeguarding practice. So we're going to look at this through a safeguarding lens to remind ourselves of some vital ground rules for our own work. As church leaders, others will consider us to be in positions of power and authority over them. We might not feel it ourselves. But some leaders will consider that they themselves have power and authority over others. So we need to be aware of this in our interactions with people day by day. All of those in leadership roles need to be aware of the risk of abuse of trust. That's any situation where a leader uses or misuses their position or authority in regard to their relationship with, treatment of, or contact with somebody under their authority. Looking at children and young people first, we know it's easy for younger people to form strong attachments to adults who they feel they can relate to. Our model safeguarding policy and procedures talks about this and suggests that young adult leaders should not be given supervisory responsibility for the age group directly below them, and that no one should be given a formal leadership role until they're at least 18. You might want to consider using a mentoring arrangement for young leaders in your church to make sure that they are accountable and supported, and that they can talk through some of the relational challenges of moving from being part of a peer group into a leadership role. We also recommend that there's a clear school year between members of a group and those who lead it. If you are an elder or a minister in a church, you might find that on occasion a church leader will come to you, either to disclose feelings or actions they've taken towards somebody who they have leadership responsibility for. The fact that they've disclosed it to you does not take away the requirement to follow your safeguarding procedures to deal with this situation. So use the 4 R's: recognise, respond, record and report to deal with the matter. And don't forget that if the issue is about the behaviour of an accredited Baptist minister, you're going to need to refer it to the ministries team at Baptist House within 24 hours, and they'll be able to help you from there. As part of their ministerial training, all ministers are taught about the importance of pastoral boundaries. Well, we've talked together about good safeguarding policy and procedure, and we've talked about what best practice looks like in church life. But it is important that church leaders and others in church life have an understanding of what to do and what happens once the police are involved in a safeguarding case. So we're going to talk together now about criminal proceedings. Let's start by just clearing up the different stages of charge and caution and conviction. So is someone an offender at the point of charge? Well, our law very clearly says that someone is innocent until they've been proven guilty. However, we must implement our church safeguarding procedures whilst that legal process takes place. So does this situation change with a police caution? Well, yes, it does. A formal police caution or verbal warning requires that the offender has made a full admission of the offence. So if a person has been cautioned, they've signed legal documents to say that they committed that offence against the child or adult at risk. They have admitted that they are guilty. Once someone has been convicted, this means that a court has decided that the offence has been proved beyond all reasonable doubt. Well, what happens when criminal proceedings fail? Well, sadly, not being convicted doesn't always mean that the person is not guilty. It might mean that there was insufficient evidence to prove the offence beyond all reasonable doubt. In fact, research says that 90% of offenders will never be convicted of their offences, and so those offences won't show up on a DBS check. I'd remind you that DBS checks alone are not the answer to understanding whether somebody is a potential risk in your church family. So someone might be guilty of offences against children or adults' risk and never have a criminal conviction for it. This is why having a clear church safeguarding policy and procedures in every group and activity puts hurdles and obstacles in place that ensure that the wrong people will be prevented or deterred from gaining a position of trust, working with your children, your young people, or adults at risk. By wrong, we mean people for whom it's not safe for them to engage in that work. Well, in many of our Baptist churches, there are people who attend regularly, who are church members, who join in with church life, who may have a conviction for abuse. So let's talk briefly about managing and monitoring those people in your church. So that could be somebody who's been convicted of offence, it could be somebody who's been cautioned, or it could be somebody who is awaiting a court process or a police decision. Our union policy is to encourage churches to use safeguarding contracts to manage and monitor known offenders and those who've been accused of abusing others. Safeguarding contracts aren't legally binding, but they serve to focus the mind and actions of all those involved. So a contract is a written agreement put in place with known offenders or those who have been accused of abusing others. For example, that could be someone who's been arrested and is under police investigation, or someone who has been disciplined or banned by their professional body. The wording of a contract will vary depending on the circumstances, and it's really important that you carry out a risk assessment as part of putting the contract in place in the first place. This is work that your designated person for safeguarding will do, normally in liaison with your association's safeguarding lead. So contracts are designed to protect everyone involved in church life, particularly children and adults at risk. They also help to protect offenders or alleged offenders from further allegations. If someone's coming back to your church after a prison sentence, then their probation officer will be able to give you some guidance on the terms of their probation and how those link into attending church and a church-based safeguarding contract. So you'll need to establish a small group of people in your church who can confidentially oversee the contract and support the offender or alleged offender to be able to participate in church life. Usually this will be the minister, the DPS, and 2 or 3 other church trustees or other spiritually mature Christians from the membership, and they may need support themselves. Your local association's safeguarding lead can tell you more about this and can help you with the contracts process. And we're going to hear from Gary Woodall from WebNet, who's going to talk about putting contracts in place and the help that's available from your local association. So Gary, we've been talking about when risk assessments and safeguarding contracts might be necessary in church life. How can the regional team support a church when there's a need to put a contract in place?
I think actually we have quite an important role to play here. Often a local church is subjective because they know the people involved. By bringing someone like myself in from the association, we're able to objectively talk through with the church and also with the person involved, with not being influenced that we actually know them. The other part we can play here is to liaise on behalf of the church with some of those in authority, local designated officers, police, probation officers, because sometimes their understanding of church is very different from a Baptist. So we can actually support a local church in doing that.
Thank you. And part of putting a safeguarding contract in place is establishing a monitoring group who are going to stand with that person, making sure that the contract works smoothly, often over many years. So what sort of people are best suited to be members of a monitoring group?
I think the important thing is to understand is that the monitoring group is there to support the individual, but they're also there to monitor. And that's an important balance to keep.
Yes.
So the people involved in that shouldn't be the best friend of the person. It also should be someone who's mature, able to think clearly, and actually wants the best for that person, also best for the young people and children and adults at risk in the local church.
And in terms of the monitoring of a contract, how often would you suggest that a church monitors a contract when it's been put in place?
Normally we would suggest probably about every 6 months or so, because it depends on how this person is coping to how that contract is adjusted or not. And also it's helpful with those in the local authority, police, probation officers, etc., that we actually keep them involved. because there may be things outside of our remit that they need to be informed of, or they can inform us of it.
While all this is happening in your church, don't forget to think about the issues in terms of communicating with your church family and others outside the church. So how do you respond when someone in your church family is accused of abuse and the press get involved? Well, if you're not the DPS, speak with them straight away so that you are clear on how this will work in the context of your church safeguarding policy and procedures. Firstly, it's a good idea to take some advice. Your association safeguarding lead can connect the minister or the DPS to the national safeguarding team, who have lots of experience of putting together press statements where safeguarding matters are involved. Secondly, it's normally best if just one or two people in the church are authorised to deal with the press, so that all contact goes to the same point. You may need to brief your church members, but do take advice on when to do this, as it's important to be careful not to interfere in any way with a live police investigation. Do remember that you don't have the right to share details of the names of those involved in safeguarding allegations, even if the press suggests names to you, nor should you start to comment on the personalities or the character of people you think are involved. Some church members will need to be reminded of this, particularly if something is in the press over a prolonged period of time. And one point specifically for ministers. It's very common for ministers to be asked to provide character references for alleged abusers who have connection with the church as they prepare to attend court. You may want to help, and it can be difficult to say no, but we would advise ministers not to act in this capacity. So we're nearly at the end of our session, and we hope that you found it useful to talk through the basics of good safeguarding practice in a church setting. We hope that you can apply what you've learnt or been reminded of in the role that you do. Our last set of questions for you to stop and consider are about what you're going to do with what you've learnt today. So please pause the video and take a few minutes to think through the final few questions that you'll see on the slide. Once you've finished, please resume the video. In making this film, we've condensed 8 hours of face-to-face training into just under 2 hours of film. So we're conscious that there's a lot more to read, to learn, to share about safeguarding in Baptist churches. The Baptist Together website is a really useful source of information and contains policies, guides, latest news features and key contacts, and lots more information about safeguarding in a church context. Please do check the website regularly to keep up to date with best practice. Whatever your role is in the life of your church, we want you to know that the regional and national safeguarding teams regularly pray for you and your work. Thank you so much for all the ways that you serve in your church. Finally, all of us who've been involved in this film want to say a massive thank you to you for working through the session today. We'd really appreciate it if you'd take a few minutes before you go to fill in the feedback form that's attached to your session invitation. I've asked Andy Thomas, producer of our film and accredited Baptist minister at Cafe Church in Bristol, to close in prayer for us today. Thank you, Andy.
Loving and gracious God, help us to transform our Baptist movement into a place of safety and love for all. We ask your forgiveness for the times we have failed to protect the vulnerable in our care, and we pray for courage, compassion and determination so that we will reach out to those who are wounded by abuse. We dedicate ourselves to this work of safeguarding and pray that you will help us to be a people known for creating communities of safety, love and acceptance for all. In the name of Christ, Amen.